The grand cathedral of Oakhaven was wrapped in the suffocating silence of absolute, unbroken grief. Stained glass windows cast long, bleeding streaks of violet and crimson light across the cold marble floor of the nave, where 300 nobles, knights, and magistrates sat motionless in their mourning blacks. At the head of the aisle rested an empty bier of black iron and white lilies, draped in the royal crimson banner of the sunken reach, the final, desolate resting place of Princess Vaelia. For 3 long years, the kingdom had bled beneath the heavy shadow of her loss. She had fallen at the Battle of Red Ridge, charging alone into the teeth of the northern horde to buy her father's retreating army precious time before the mountain pass collapsed. The official report, written in the shaking hand of Lord Commander Vane, had been stark and final. No body recovered, swallowed by the abyss of the crushing avalanche. The princess is with the ancestors. Upon the high dais, King Alistair sat slumped in the iron throne, his once formidable frame shrunken and hollowed out by sorrow, his crown resting heavily on a head bowed in permanent defeat. Beside him stood Chancellor Morveth, his sharp, calculating eyes scanning the mourning assembly with a look of cold, administrative satisfaction. With the princess dead, the royal bloodline was effectively extinguished, leaving the path wide open for the Chancellor's secret council to seize absolute control of the crown jewels and the northern mineral trade by the stroke of a midnight decree. "We gather today," Chancellor Morveth began, his voice echoing smoothly off the vaulted stone ceiling as he stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. "Not merely to mourn a fallen warrior, but to seal the chapter of an era. Princess Vaelia was a daughter of fire, but even the brightest flames must eventually turn to ash. Let us commend her restless spirit to the void, and look forward to the stability of a new, unbroken dawn under the Regency Council." A heavy, mournful murmur rippled through the gathered nobility, several ladies pressing lace handkerchiefs to dry eyes, while Lord Commander Vane stared blankly at the floor. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his weathered cheek. Vane knew the truth, or at least he thought he did. He had been the one who ordered the retreat. He had watched the snow swallow the ridge. Yet, as the Chancellor raised his golden staff to signal the final closing prayers, a strange, low-frequency sound vibrated through the heavy oak doors at the far end of the cathedral. Thump. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like the heavy, iron-shod heel of a travel-worn boot striking the flagstones outside with deliberate, crushing force. The assembly froze mid-whisper. Chancellor Morveth's staff hovered. The massive iron-banded doors didn't swing open gently. They exploded inward on their hinges with a deafening crash that sent jagged splinters flying across the polished marble floor. A thick, freezing gust of wind swept down the nave, instantly extinguishing half the ceremonial candles and filling the sacred hall with the sharp, unmistakable scent of burning pine, dried salt, and old blood. Through the clearing dust, framed by the blinding white light of the midday sun, stood a solitary figure. He was a stranger wrapped in a tattered, oil-stained traveler's cloak of heavy gray wool that dragged in the dust. His face was hidden deep behind a broad-rimmed leather hood, and in his right hand, he dragged a massive, notched broadsword that left a deep, screeching gouge in the sacred stone. "Halt!" shouted Captain of the Guard Moros, stepping forward and drawing his gleaming silver-plated saber. "By order of the Chancellor, this is a consecrated house of mourning. Identify yourself, vagrant, or be executed on the spot." The stranger didn't stop. He didn't speak. He simply took one slow, heavy step forward, his boots leaving dark, wet prints of melting snow upon the immaculate white marble. Chancellor Morveth's face flushed with angry crimson, his composure fracturing under the blatant disrespect. "Guards!" Morveth shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the intruder. "Seize him. Feed him to the dungeon rats before he desecrates the royal bier." For elite palace guards lunged from the shadows of the pillars, their halberds leveled at the stranger's chest in a synchronized, lethal thrust. The stranger didn't even raise his sword. With a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, he swept his left hand outward from beneath his cloak. A heavy, silver-chained iron flail cracked through the air like thunder, wrapping around the 4 halberd shafts with brutal physics. With a sickening crunch of splintered ash and shrieking steel, the guards were yanked off their feet and slammed violently into the marble floor, knocked unconscious before they could draw a second breath. A collective gasp of sheer terror echoed through the noble assembly. Ladies screamed, magistrates scrambled backward over their wooden benches, and Lord Commander Vane's hand flew instinctively to the pommel of his own sword, his eyes narrowing with sudden, agonizing suspicion. The stranger stood alone in the center of the aisle, standing over the fallen guards. Slowly, deliberately, the robed traveler reached up with a gloved hand and gripped the brim of his leather hood, pulling it back to reveal a face burned by desert suns, scarred by jagged steel, and hardened by years of unimaginable torment. King Alistair gasped, rising halfway out of the Iron Throne, his mouth opening in a silent, disbelieving cry as his trembling hands gripped the armrests. It wasn't a stranger. It was Princess Ellidyr. Her once flowing golden hair was cropped short like a mercenary's. A livid purple burn scar ran from her left jawline up into her temple, and her eyes, once the bright, innocent blue of a royal courtier, were now the hard, cold, dead-eyed stare of a ghost who had clawed her way out of hell itself. "You!" Chancellor Morveth stammered, stumbling backward until his spine hit the edge of the royal dais, his face draining of every drop of color until he looked like a corpse. That's impossible. The avalanche. The report said you were crushed." Ellidyr didn't look at the Chancellor. She kept her cold, unflinching gaze locked entirely on the broken, weeping figure of her father, King Alistair, who had tumbled down the steps of the dais and was crawling across the stone toward her. "My little bird," the king choked out, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks as he reached out a shaking hand to touch her armor. You're alive. How did you survive?" Ellidyr looked down at her father, her expression devoid of warmth, her jaw set like granite. "I didn't survive the avalanche, father," Ellidyr said, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like grinding stones. "The avalanche was just the beginning." Before the king could touch her gauntlet, a sudden, blinding flash of purple lightning tore through the stained glass window above the altar, shattering the sacred panes into a million glittering fragments. From the shattered aperture, a second figure dropped gracefully onto the stone floor, a towering, multi-jointed Xylarian mercenary clad in jagged, iridescent void chitin armor, holding a crackling plasma carbine pointed squarely at the princess's spine. "Target sighted," the alien mercenary shrieked, its multi-jointed mandibles clicking wildly as its 4 violet ocular sensors flared with lethal intent. "The bounty on the surviving royal bloodline is claimed by the hegemony." The entire cathedral plunged into absolute, chaotic panic. Nobles trampled over one another, screaming as they scrambled toward the heavy oak exit doors, while Chancellor Morveth's expression suddenly shifted from stark terror to a cold, calculating grin of profound realization. "You should have stayed dead in the northern wastes, princess." Morveth laughed maniacally, pointing at her from the safety of the dais. "The hegemony paid handsomely for your absence." Ellidyr didn't even turn around. With terrifying speed, she drew her notched broadsword, spun on her heel, and caught the alien's plasma blast directly on the flat of her blade. The energy wave deflected harmlessly into the stone ceiling, showering the aisle in white-hot sparks. Before the mercenary could fire a second shot, Ellidyr drove her steel-toed boot into its lower chest joint, snapping the chitin in half with a sickening crack. The alien collapsed instantly, gasping for breath, its weapon clattering across the marble floor. Ellidyr placed her heavy iron boot directly on the mercenary's primary respiratory valve, crushing it beneath her heel while keeping her cold blue eyes locked on the terrified chancellor. "You thought the northern wastes were a prison, Morveth?" Ellidyr whispered, her voice cutting through the screams of the fleeing nobles like a razor. "You thought selling the border defenses to the Outer Rim warlords would buy you a crown." Morveth's laughter died in his throat. He backed away until he hit the heavy iron doors of the throne room, his hands trembling violently. How did you escape the work camps?" "No one survives the sulfur mines of Vraksh." Ellidyr stepped forward, dragging her bloody sword behind her, leaving a deep, sparking gouge in the sacred stone. Because I didn't work the mines? Eladir replied, a dark, humorless smile touching her scarred lips. I took over the warden's fortress. Before Morveth could scream for help, a deep, earth-shattering rumble shook the entire cathedral foundation, causing the stone pillars to groan and the altar candles to dance wildly. Outside the shattered stained-glass windows, the bright midday sky was suddenly blotted out by a massive, continent-sized shadow. A 3-mile-long, matte-black Xylarian dreadnought descended silently through the clouds, hovering directly above Oakhaven, its primary antimatter cannons charging with a low, ominous hum that vibrated inside everyone's chest. The flagship, Morveth whispered, his knees buckling beneath him as he stared out the window in absolute, unadulterated horror. You brought an armada back with you? Not an armada, Chancellor, Eladir corrected softly, stopping 3 paces away from him. An execution squad. The heavy iron doors at the rear of the cathedral blew completely off their hinges for a second time that day, showering the hall in a storm of splinters and thick, white smoke. Through the clearing haze marched 500 battle-hardened mercenaries, ex-slaves, and disgraced royal guards who had fought alongside Eladir in the dark pits of the northern sector. All wearing the crimson insignia of the Sunken Reach, their weapons raised and ready. At their head walked General Thorn, a towering veteran with a cybernetic eye that glowed a steady, lethal red. He scanned the terrified assembly, stopped his gaze on Chancellor Morveth, and spat a glob of blood onto the marble. The perimeter is secured, Princess, Thorn reported, his gravelly voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Every escape route is locked down. Not a single rat leaves this cathedral alive. King Alistair staggered back to his feet, staring in absolute shock at the massive army occupying his sacred hall. His hands trembling as he looked between his daughter and the alien dreadnought hovering outside. Eladir, what have you become? The king whispered, tears of grief and disbelief streaming down his weathered cheeks. You're leading an army of outlaws and alien mercenaries? You've destroyed our home. Eladir stopped. She looked at her father, the man who had signed the treaty abandoning her division to the Northern Horde 3 years ago to save his own throne. Your home was already destroyed, father, Eladir said, her voice chillingly calm. I merely came back to collect the rent. She raised her hand, signaling General Thorn to bring forward a heavy, iron-bound chest. The chest was dropped onto the floor before the king with a heavy, metallic thud that cracked the marble flags. Thorn popped the brass latches with a dagger and threw the lid wide open. Inside weren't gold coins or royal jewels. It was a stack of thousands of encrypted confession ledgers, stolen directly from Chancellor Morveth's private vault, detailing every bribe, every treasonous border betrayal, and every planned assassination that had kept the royal family in power while the common people starved. King Alistair stared down at the documents, his face draining of every drop of color. He reached out with a trembling hand, picked up the topmost parchment bearing his own royal seal countersigned by the Chancellor, and let out a soft, broken gasp. You knew, the king whispered, looking up at his daughter with eyes full of utter despair. You knew before you even went to Red Ridge. I knew the day I was given a blunted sword and broken armor, Eladir replied, her voice dropping to an icy, unforgiving whisper. You sent me to die, father. You and your council traded my life for 3 more years of hollow peace. Chancellor Morveth, realizing his life was entirely forfeit, suddenly lunged forward from the doorway, drawing a concealed silver stiletto from his sleeve with desperate, animalistic fury. If I die, you die with me, bitch, Morveth shrieked, charging straight toward Eladir's unprotected back with the knife raised high. Before the blade could even clear the air, a deafening crack echoed through the cathedral. It wasn't a sword strike. It was the sharp, concussive report of a heavy plasma pistol fired from the gallery above. A bolt of blinding blue plasma slammed directly into Chancellor Morveth's chest, vaporizing his heart instantly and sending him crashing backward through the stained glass window into the abyss below. Everyone froze. Slowly, every head in the cathedral turned upward toward the elevated stone balcony above the choir loft. Leaning casually against the carved stone railing was a figure wearing a heavy, oil-stained trench coat, smoking a glowing, filtered compression cigar. As the smoke cleared, the figure lowered his hood, revealing a sharp, angular face covered in old battle scars and a smirk that could charm a dragon out of its gold. It was Captain Jace Vane, the younger brother of Lord Commander Vane, whom the royal court had declared executed for treason 2 years prior for attempting to mutiny against the crown's corrupt tax policies. "Nice shot, Jace," General Thorne called out, lowering his weapon with a dry grin. Jace flicked his cigar ash over the balcony rail, watching it drift down through the shattered stained glass light. "Always hated that guy's tailoring," Jace called back down, his voice echoing smoothly across the hall. "Ruined the aesthetic of the whole cathedral." King Alistair dropped to his knees, his crown tumbling from his head and rolling across the bloody marble until it stopped against the toe of Eladir's heavy combat boot. The absolute silence of the cathedral was deafening. The nobles cowered in the corners, the guards surrendered their weapons without a fight, and the grand, unbreakable illusion of the royal dynasty shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Eladir looked down at the golden crown resting against her boot. She didn't pick it up. She didn't wear it. Instead, she slowly raised her right foot and brought it down hard, crushing the gold circlet into a flat, unrecognizable scrap of twisted metal. "The war isn't over, father," Eladir whispered, leaning down so only the trembling king could hear her words. "The real war is just beginning, and this time, I'm writing the reports."